everyone from around the country, and welcome to today's seminar. It's the first one for 2026, so welcome to a new year. I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional owners and their custodianship of the many different lands on which we meet today. And I pay our respects to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. And we recognize their valuable contributions to Australian and global society. So today we're going to hear from Professor Luke Hyde, who is visiting from University of Michigan. He's in Sydney at the moment and will talk to us about parents, neighborhoods, and the developing brain. Then I hand over to Deborah.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. Many of you will be aware that when we refunded the center, we added a new research program in the cognitive science of disadvantage. And we did that because we were interested in questions around the way that disadvantage was affecting cognitive functioning, and also the way that cognitive functioning was affecting disadvantage. And we wanted to layer this new research program on top of what had been core strengths of the Life Course Center from the beginning, which was really an understanding of families, children, and parenting. So our speaker today, Luke Hyde, is really working at the forefront of all of these issues. Luke is a professor of psychology at the University of Michigan. His PhD is in clinical and developmental psychology, and he has a concentration in neuroscience. He does a lot of things, but I think the best way to sort of summarize what he's interested in is trying to develop a deeper understanding of the way that adversity and inequality impact brain and behavioral development, both in early childhood and all the way up through adolescence into young adulthood. And he's particularly interested in identifying the factors that promote resilience among children and families that are experiencing disadvantage. So with that, I'll hand over to Luke. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks, Deborah, for the nice introduction, and greetings to everyone. Thanks for having me. It's nice to be in Sydney today, and hope everyone across the country that's visiting is doing well. So today I'm going to talk about some of my work. It's always a little funny doing it virtually because I feel like I'm putting on the Luke show in an office room, but I'm going to talk about some of my work looking at parenting, neighborhoods, and the developing brain. So my broad research program really aims to understand how poverty and inequality and concentrated disadvantage increases risk for psychopathology. And I'm particularly interested in antisocial behavior. So this is early behavior problems, aggression, and rule breaking, as well as more severe presentations like psychopathy. And we also do some work on resilience to understand why some kids don't end up with these outcomes. But today I'm going to focus mostly on some of the earlier pieces of this, that is, the associations between contexts related to poverty and the developing brain. And broadly, my interest is understanding the mechanisms linking poverty to child psychopathology. So what are the more proximal contexts, like in the family, like parenting, or in the neighborhood, as well as how do these experiences become biologically embedded? And then finally, how does individual variability in kids, whether it's their genes or other contextual buffers, increase or decrease risk over time? So I want to talk to you about some of the work that we've been doing in my lab, thinking about the brain in context. We really conceptualize the brain as being at the center of sort of a peeled onion in which everything from policies to culture filter down to the child's developing brain across the lifespan. So when I first started doing this work, when I got to the University of Michigan, there had been a bunch of research starting to connect socioeconomic status and poverty to the developing brain. Most of this work had looked at brain structure, and we're talking about like the volume of different areas of the brain. So even though those links were there, we had a couple additional questions that we wanted to ask. First, I'm much more interested in brain function, especially if we look in specific areas of the brain that we know a lot about, to understand whether something about SES or poverty might be tuning the brain in different ways that might be adaptive in some contexts and not adaptive in other contexts, and might potentially raise the risk for psychopathology. Second, a lot of the work in this area had been done either in sort of community convenient samples where there wasn't actual poverty, or in really extreme situations like in cases of child abuse within Child Protective Services, or a bunch of work had been done looking at social deprivation for kids who've been in Romanian orphanages. And though a lot of that work was really important, we wondered whether these mechanisms and these associations might go more broadly to normative experiences. So, for example, whether your parent is more or less harsh, might that be related to brain development? Second, a lot of this work at the time was cross-sectional, and we were really interested in whether there were perspective or longitudinal associations. And to the extent we could look at that, we also wondered whether the timing of experiences matter in terms of their impacts on the brain. And then finally, when I got to Michigan, I started spending time at our Institute for Social Research, hanging out with demographers and thinking a lot more about sampling. And so most of the research, as I said, had been convenience samples. So we wanted to do this work in samples that were representative and had a clear sampling frame, but also were enriched for actual poverty. Again, a lot of the work that had been done in this had been in large samples that may not capture folks, really experiencing true poverty. And then finally, particularly in the US, I think it was important to look at this at the intersection with families of color who are facing both poverty and additional levels of adversity and discrimination. So some of the guiding models for this work are principles from developmental psychopathology that posit that these experiences of the child are transactional. That is, children are both being influenced by their experiences and they're influencing those experiences. So, for example, they're evoking different things from their parents just as their parents are influencing them. And that these come across multiple layers of influence. The bottom right corner, you can see the Bronfenbrenner circle of influences. And a lot of this work has been guided by the family stress model by Rand Conger and elaborated by one of my colleagues, Vonnie McLeod, which posits that poverty and changes in economic status affect children via their effects on parents. So economic pressure stresses parents, leads to conflict in the family, and that undermines their parents' ability to be warm and less harsh. There's also a family investment model that posits that some of the impacts of poverty have to do with investment. I'm not going to talk as much about that today, but that's probably related more closely to cognitive outcomes and school outcomes, whereas I'll be focusing more on psychopathology. Before I get into some of my research, I want to also emphasize what I'm not saying. So poverty, inequality, and SES are the result of multiple nested systems that are made by deep inequalities rooted in histories of oppression. And in the US and in other countries across the world, this disproportionately targets and affects people of colors. So if you look at the map there, that's a redlining map of the city of Detroit. And in the 1920s, there was systematic mortgage discrimination based on how places were graded. The red areas are the center of Detroit, and those were places where you couldn't get mortgages because the corporation had labeled them as problematic because of people of color or immigrants. So I want to be clear that these are really structural issues, and that when we talk about parents or neighborhoods, we're not saying that they should be doing something different. We're not blaming parents or communities, rather trying to understand what it is that's undermining their ability to do the best for their children. In terms of developmental periods, as Deborah said, I'm really interested in two periods. One is the toddler and preschool period. This is the time when kids gain new physical mobility. They lack emotion regulation. If you have had children, you definitely recognize this period. It's a big challenge for parents. It's also a big peak for neural change. The brain is rapidly developing. That's why kids get through this era and learn to better regulate their emotions and inhibit their behaviors. But it can be a challenging time. I think of adolescence as a really similar period. This is the time when kids are getting more new mobility, spending more time outside the home. And their brain is also rapidly developing. It can be a new challenge for parents. This is also a time when mental health problems become more prevalent with new onsets. And then finally, the places in the brain we're looking at. I'm going to talk, for the most part in this talk, about the amygdala, which is part of the cortical limbic circuit, which has to do with processing emotions, regulating our emotions. And the key thing to take away about the amygdala is it's this area of our brain that tells us what's important to be paying attention to. So if I said, there's a snake or a spider in the corner that's about to bite you, which I feel like when I get this talk in Australia, it feels slightly more likely. You would be paying attention with your amygdala. Amygdala would be saying this is something we need to pay attention to, and it might give you that feeling of fear. So the amygdala can help tell us about what people are paying attention to. And it's also important in terms of reactivity to threat, learning, fear conditioning, and initiating the stress system. It grows mostly in early childhood, and it's been linked to multiple forms of psychopathology. I'll talk briefly about some of these other systems that we've outlined, but the amygdala will be the main one. Okay, so early in my career at the University of Michigan, one of my first graduate students, Ariana Gard, who's now faculty at the University of Maryland, and I started working on a project examining various different adversities. We looked at sociodemographic factors, family process, and community factors. We wanted to know which of these might be the most important or have the most influence, explain the most variance in amygdala activity. In this case, we were looking at this in early childhood and trying to think about amygdala activity in early adulthood. To do this, we used the Pitt Mother and Child Project. This is run by Danny Schott at the University of Pittsburgh, who is my PhD mentor. This is 310 boys recruited from women, infant, children's centers. These are nutritional supplement centers in the U.S. You have to be at 200% of the poverty line or below to be eligible. So it's a relatively low income sample of all boys in Pittsburgh. And just as an example of how those structures change, out of the 300 boys, by the time they were 15, 100 of those 300 already had court records, which again shows you that growing up as a boy in a low-income family in Pittsburgh unfortunately predicts negative bad outcomes. So when we looked at all the adversities at zero order level, we found that many of them predicted amygdala activity. In this case, we were looking at amygdala activity when people were looking at these fearful faces. But when we put them in a regression together, we found that harsh parenting and neighborhood deprivation explained the most variance in amygdala activity, most unique variance. And I'll say that these were measured observationally. So harsh parenting was measured through coding of a family interaction task when kids were cleaning toys. We watched parenting during that time, and neighborhood deprivation was based on census data. We found that both harsh parenting and neighborhood deprivation predicted amygdala activity, and these were measured. Harsh parenting, neighborhood deprivation at age 2 predicted amygdala activity at age 20, which in turn predicted symptoms of antisocial personality disorder. So again, symptoms of severe aggression and rule breaking. And harsh parenting predicted antisocial personality disorder symptoms via amygdala activity. So this is sort of a proof of concept that part of the reason harsh parenting may predict some of these psychopathology outcomes is via the impact on the brain. From there, we got really interested in whether the timing of these experiences mattered. So we know the amygdala grows really rapidly early in life, but the prefrontal cortex, that is the front of your brain that has to do with inhibiting responses, regulating emotions, thinking more complex thoughts, executive functioning, that part of your brain grows well into adolescence and even early adulthood. So we wondered whether the part of the brain that was growing would be the most affected by experiences during that period. To do this, we shifted over to the study of adolescent to adult neurodevelopment, which is a project between me, Chris Monk, and Coulter Mitchell at the University of Michigan. And this is piggybacking on the Future of Families and Child Wellbeing study, which is a sample of almost 5,000 children sampled from hospitals in 20 U.S. cities. They oversampled 3-to-1 for non-marital births, and based on the demographics of the U.S., that leads to a relatively low-income sample that's ethnically and racially diverse. Based on the cities that we selected, this resulted for us in a primarily Black, non-Hispanic identifying sample with relatively low income. And so the advantage of us partnering with the Future of Families and studying kids when they were 15 is that we had 15 years of data that they had been collecting on families since birth. And so to look at timing, Ariana took measures of harsh parenting from ages 3. And she created a growth curve where the intercept is age 3, so sort of where you're starting in terms of harsh parenting, and the slope looks at the change over time in harsh parenting. In this case, most parents are getting slightly less harsh over time. And she found that the intercept, that is harsh parenting during preschool period, was related to greater amygdala activity to these angry faces. But that changes, that is the slope, was related to activity in the anterior cingulate cortex, which is part of this prefrontal part of the brain that has to do with regulating emotions and behavior. So in other words, the part of the brain here that was developing the fastest seemed to be affected the most by parenting during that period. We've also done this more recently in sort of more complex ways. So a grad student in my lab currently, Clantis Michael, used more complex measures of the brain, looking at the organization of the whole brain and the connections between the brain when you're lying in the scanner at rest or mind wandering. And what's interesting is that he found that early childhood, earlier in life, we see that harsh parenting is associated with broader, the organization of the whole brain. Whereas as we go later in life, it's more and more narrow circuitry. So just the amygdala, prefrontal cortex connectivity. So this is the idea that maybe early experiences have more diffuse impacts in the brain, and later experiences have more specific ones, particularly in the later developing parts of the brain. So shifting from parenting to neighborhood, I'm going to go back to the original study that I talked about from Ariana's paper. We also looked at amygdala activity, these neutral faces. I don't know about you, I find this neutral face kind of terrifying. It's like a still face for developmental psychologists, but it's really ambiguous. It's not clear what's happening or how you should be reacting. And Ariana found that neighborhood deprivation, that is living in a lower income, more disadvantaged neighborhood, was related to greater amygdala activity to these neutral faces. Now, in some sense, this might make sense. That is, living in more disadvantaged neighborhoods might make you less attuned to emotion in others, but more attuned to ambiguous situations because they might be more dangerous. But we weren't sure this was sort of the first finding. So we wanted to see if we could replicate this in another sample and also look at the timing. So to do this, we took the Pitt Mother and Child Project and the SAND study, and we used the census data about neighborhood disadvantage in childhood and adolescence. And then they had brain at slightly different times. And we looked to see whether neighborhood disadvantage would be related to this greater amygdala activity in neutral faces, and whether that might be related differently depending on the timing of exposure. And so we found in both samples that in early childhood, greater amygdala activity was related to greater neighborhood disadvantage. And in the SAND study, we found that greater neighborhood disadvantage during adolescence was related to greater activity in this dorsal anterior cingulate area. So very similar to the last study, which again overlaps with the parenting study, suggesting that the part of the brain that's developing the most rapidly seems to be the one most closely correlated with the experience. So just to summarize so far, so parenting is associated with blunted amygdala activity of fear and anger, that is potentially showing less reactivity to these signs of emotions in others. Neighborhood disadvantage is associated with greater activities, ambiguous neutral faces. We think there's some developmental specificity, that is the amygdala in preschool years and the prefrontal cortex later in childhood and adolescence. We've done some recent extensions of this, also looking at neighborhood poverty and other parts of the brain, the way the brain is organized. So our next questions are, first, do these effects of the neighborhood extend beyond the cortical limbic system, so beyond the amygdala? Do they impact other parts of the brain? Second, to ask, what are the mechanisms? What is it about living in a disadvantaged neighborhood that might make it be associated with brain function? And then finally, ask whether there are buffers of these effects. So to do a bunch of the work I'm going to talk about now, we shifted to our M-twin study. This is a collaboration with Alex Burt at Michigan State. So Alex recruited a sample of twins that were representative of Southeast and South Central Michigan, so within 120 miles of East Lansing, which includes cities like Detroit and Flint, suburban areas like Ann Arbor, and rural areas. And then she did another sample that was from the same frame, but she only selected those that lived in neighborhoods with at least 10% of families living below the poverty line, which was the median at the time. So she's essentially selecting families living in above average neighborhoods with poverty. We then followed up in partnership with the second sample, those living in higher neighborhood poverty, as well as those in the first sample that would have qualified for the second sample. So this is a sample of those living above average in neighborhoods with above average poverty, but there's a lot of variability. You could live in a census tract that has high poverty, but still be living in, still have a lot of family income. So our first question was whether neighborhood disadvantage was associated with functioning in other systems. And the first one we looked at was the cortical striatal system that responds to reward. We found that neighborhood disadvantage was positively associated with activity in the ventral striatum. This is a part of the brain that reacts to anticipating and receiving rewards. And to do this, we have a fun card flipping task that kids do, and then they get coins or they lose coins. In this case, Heidi found that those that lived in a more disadvantaged neighborhood had greater ventral striatum reactivity to reward, suggesting that maybe these kids are more sensitive to the anticipation or receipt of getting these rewards, which again might make sense if there's not a lot of resources in where you're living, you might be more sensitive to rewards. We also looked at inhibitory control systems that have to do with inhibiting behavior. And this is work by Rachel Tomlinson, who's a postdoc at UCSF now. And she found using this whack-a-mole task where you have to whack moles, but not whack vegetables that pop up, which gets you wanting to whack and then needing to stop. This activates the inferior frontal gyrus, which is lit up there. And she found that greater neighborhood disadvantage was associated with less activation in this area. And importantly, she showed that neighborhood poverty predicted response inhibition, that is how well kids could stop themselves from hitting the eggplants, via less activity in the inferior frontal jack. The other thing that I found really interesting about the study was that at the time, most people had been looking at income and parent, particularly maternal education, as predicting these response inhibition and brain outcomes. They hadn't been measuring neighborhood. And so we thought this was important because in this study, in zero order correlations, all three of these predictors, income, education, and neighborhood, were all related to brain and behavior having to do with response inhibition. But when we put them together, it's really neighborhood poverty that seems to be driving the effect. So I worry that a bunch of past studies maybe were missing this important confounder, which again has different policy implications in terms of whether we're thinking about neighborhood poverty versus family poverty. So what is it about the neighborhood that's predicting something about the child's brain? The neighborhood is a proxy for many things, from toxin exposure to school quality. One of the first places we've looked is also to look at exposure to community violence. Unfortunately, when we have concentrated disadvantage, that increases the risk for community violence, which is a scary and stressful experience for kids. And parts of the brain, like the amygdala that we're looking at, have a lot of receptors for things like cortisol, which help propagate the stress system. So one of our first questions, this is work done by Gabby Suarez, who is a grad student in my lab and is now at UC Irvine. She asked whether exposure to community violence might be related to amygdala activity to threat. In this case, she's looking at anger and fearful faces. And she found that exposure to community violence was related to amygdala activity, to greater amygdala activity, and that explained the relationship between neighborhood disadvantage and amygdala activity. That is, maybe this is one of the mechanisms through which neighborhood disadvantage is related to greater amygdala activity. We saw a very similar pattern looking at the reward data. This is, again, from a grad student, Hyde Westerman in my lab, who's just finishing up her PhD now. And she found that exposure to community violence was also an indirect pathway from neighborhood disadvantage to ventral striatum reactivity to reward, again, suggesting that maybe exposure to community violence is one of the means through which neighborhood disadvantage predicts reward-related neural activity. So from here, we wanted to start looking at protective factors. One of my critiques of the field in developmental neuroscience is we've done a lot of looking at adversity in the brain, but not enough looking at positive factors. So as a clinician, having worked with a lot of families, there are so many families doing so many things right and kids who are thriving, even in the context of facing a lot of adversity. So for some of this work, we started looking at social factors that might help protect kids. So I want to go back to the study that I just showed you from Gabby Suarez, showing that neighborhood disadvantage predicted amygdala activity via exposure to community violence. She and I wondered whether having a really warm parent, really involved parent when you're an adolescent might help, first, protect you from being exposed to community violence, even if you live in a disadvantaged neighborhood, but then B, help you buffer the effects on the amygdala. And that's what we found. So the first was that we found, so on the x-axis is area deprivation index, which is a census measure of neighborhood disadvantage, and then community violence is on the y-axis. We find that warm and involved parents seem to decrease the association between living in a disadvantaged neighborhood and exposure to community violence. So parents who are really involved seem to get rid of that correlation. This isn't new. Lots of other people have shown this in behavioral sciences. The more unique thing was looking to see whether warm and involved parents would decrease the impact of community violence in the brain. We found that for parents who were at the mean or high levels of involvement and warmth, there was no association between exposure to community violence on the x-axis and amygdala activity to threat on the y-axis. It was only for parents who were not very involved or warm. We've seen similar things with community factors. So Gabby has another paper where she looked at neighborhood social processes. So she looked at two different factors. One is neighborhood norms, where we ask adults if they think they should do something if a child is doing something dangerous. And we also looked at collective efficacy. So this is social adhesion and informal social control. This is where adults in the neighborhood are willing to help each other out and help keep violence and other bad things from happening. And I want to note that in this study, actually, one really unique thing is that Alex Burt collected this data from random neighbors. So we get about 7 random neighbors of each participant to fill out these questionnaires. So this isn't the parent or the kid's perception of what the neighborhood's like. This is actually the neighbor's perception of what it's like. And Gabby found that neighborhood disadvantage was only related to amygdala activity when neighborhood norms were low. So if neighborhoods had high norms for protecting children, then she found that we didn't see this association between disadvantage and amygdala activity. We've seen something similar in our SAND study. This is work by Ariana Gard. She looked in the future of families, the large study, as well as in our SAND study, using geocoding of addresses to examine incidents of deadly gun violence within 500 meters of the home. And in the large sample in the future family study, she found that for kids living within 500 meters of deadly gun violence, they had increases in their risk for externalizing outcomes like aggression and rule breaking. But if the neighborhood had high collective efficacy, that is, again, neighbors were working together, then we saw that there was not nearly as big an association. And within our smaller SAND study with the brain, she found that deadly gun violence was related to lower connectivity between the amygdala and prefrontal cortex, only at low levels of collective efficacy. So again, more evidence that when neighbors are bonded together and helping to protect children, they do seem to be able to protect kids from the neural effects of disadvantage. So just to summarize, we found that parenting and neighborhood context may shape neural reactivity during socio-emotional processing. We found some direct effects, so harsh parenting and neighborhood disadvantage related to amygdala reactivity to threat and ambiguity. We think that timing matters, so regions undergoing the greatest growth might be the most sensitive. And we also found that this extends beyond just the amygdala and prefrontal cortex to the cortical limbic circuitry during reward and to the prefrontal cortex areas that have to do with inhibitory control. We think at least one of these mechanisms is exposure to community violence that links neighborhood poverty to amygdala reactivity to threat. I think that's probably just one of many mechanisms, some of which we're following up with now. But we think that warm and involved adults in children's lives can help buffer these effects. So warm parenting may buffer the effects of exposure to community violence, and positive neighborhood social processes may also buffer these impacts. So where are we going from here? A couple of different directions. The first is you might have noticed that we're doing a lot of this in a twin study. So far, we haven't used the twin nature of the study much because we were waiting until we had the entire study finished, which just happened in the last year. And one of the advantages with the twin design is that we can use the fact that we know that identical twins share all their DNA to use a twin difference model to strengthen our confidence that maybe these effects are causal. For example, in the case of parenting and amygdala activity, it could be that parents that have higher amygdala activity are also harsher and they pass on those genes to kids. And so it's really not about the parenting, but about the shared genes. By using twins, we can help separate out the genetic versus the environmental effects. And I'll say that some papers that students are working on right now, in a couple of cases, we're actually finding that some of these associations are genetic and are not environmental, which is a little bit surprising. In other work in my lab, we've partnered with an adoption study where we can also separate these because adopted kids are not genetically related to their adoptive parents and have access to the birth parents' data as well as the adoptive parents' data. And then a second major direction that we're just starting right now in collaboration with Robin Nusselok and Greg Miller at Northwestern University is we've been partnering with an intervention study that did a basic income unconditional cash transfer to adults. And they transferred fairly large amounts, $1,000 a month, to adults for 3 years. And we'll be looking to see whether those cash transfers to the adults had any effects on kids, particularly on their brain development, as well as their immune system development, and to see whether there are interactions between those. That the cash transfers will make parents less stressed. In turn, that will help make their parenting more positive, more warm, less harsh, which in turn will lead to less impacts in the brain, particularly in systems like the amygdala, and that will also not dysregulate the immune system, which will lead to decreased risk for psychopathology. Okay, so with that, I just want to stop. Thank you for everyone's attention, and I tried to make this a little shorter so there'll be time for questions, and I'm happy to answer questions and also show more slides if there are things people want to hear more in depth about. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luke. That was fascinating. When you were talking about the warmer parenting acts as a buffer, one would assume that probably harsh parenting is itself a result of probably some overreactivity to threats in the parent's brain, right? Have you studied at all what the parents' brains look like, or what can distinguish the parents who are able to parent warmer than others?
Yeah, that's a good question. We haven't done any work on the parents' brains. Actually, in the adoption study that we were for a while looking to collaborate with and do some brain imaging, one of the PIs there was really interested in that and wanted us to scan both the parents and the kids. There is some work on sort of parents' brain around kids, but I don't know any that relates it to parenting itself. Certainly, that's one of the reasons that we want to use the twin design, because, of course, parents that might be harsher might be that they're more reactive to these threats, and so maybe it is they're just passing on these experiences to their kids via genetic transmission.
You. Deborah is just asking if the brain structure is impacted by various adverse experiences. Should we think of that as permanent, or is it reversible?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think that's one of the challenges in this area. The brain is really plastic. It's changing constantly. In fact, at some level, it's everything that you experience changes your brain, right? So if you remember anything from the talk today, your brain has changed potentially in a very micro way. And so one of the challenges is understanding how long these effects might be and how permanent these effects might be. My best guess on that, and I don't think there's great data on this yet, is that the later in life these experiences happen, or the more chronic they are, probably the less changeable. But I also think that, as I talked about, different parts of the brain are developing at different rates. And so perhaps earlier developing areas are slightly less plastic later in life, but other parts of the brain might be more plastic. And so they may change in ways that help compensate for changes. So I definitely don't think any of this is deterministic. And I think that interventions can make a big difference. And I guess just one other thing I'll note is that there's been some literature about how this is communicated to the public, and the idea that this is, poor kids have holes in their brain or somehow ruined. And I think it's really important to think about this more, that our brain is really good at developing brain is really good at adapting to the environment we're in. And so, being more in tune to ambiguity when you live in a more disadvantaged area, or be more in tune to rewards, is probably really adaptive and really positive. And so part of what we're trying to learn now is in what context is it adaptive and what context is it maybe not adaptive or might raise risk, for example, for psychopathology.
Okay. That seems to perfectly lead into Simon's next question. Simon, should I just actually hand the floor to you?
Yeah, thanks. I was texting away, but I can speak. Thanks, Luke, for the presentation. And I just love that social sciences embracing neuroscience in that way over there. And I think you kind of got to my question, which was right at the start, about this is a developmental adaptation to an environment that is kind of necessary, or at least something we're wired to respond to. And I just wondered, psychopathies are a negative outcome, but can you imagine negative outcomes in the other direction? So the scenario there is warm parenting in a hostile kind of neighborhood, where you then might be leaving home less prepared or less aware, or something, that there's some unanticipated risks potentially, depending on the level of intervention, where it's not a neighborhood intervention.
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say anecdotally, my work with families as a clinical psychologist wouldn't suggest that. I think, again, developmentally appropriate parenting has to do with the context that you're in. And so monitoring your kids more in adolescence, being more involved with them, is probably going to help them handle stresses, but also help them navigate really difficult contexts as well. So I don't worry about that too much. But I do think that that's part of the magic of parenting interventions is helping parents adapt to the context. So what warm and involved parenting might look very different in a context of a neighborhood that's really disadvantaged versus one that's very advantaged. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly does, because we don't, not small birds that we just tip out of the nest. So the way in which you interact with your environment, I think, yeah, if that's something dealt with through the parenting interventions, that makes total sense.
Yeah, but I would say that I think part of the thing is that the way that we might want to target warm and involved parenting in disadvantaged context might be different than we might in an advantaged context. And so parents might be, in some advantaged context, might be being too involved because in that context it's not as necessary to be monitoring the child as much too. So I think there could be dangers on that end.
Thank you, Luke. Agnieszka is asking if, going back to your findings on reactions to ambiguous stimuli, could you tell us more how to potentially translate these findings to policy?
Mhm. Yeah, that's a good question. I think that's why I'm interested in the using the basic income study, because there's a clear policy there about unconditional cash transfers. And so far, I think the data is still really mixed on unconditional cash transfers. A lot of the work that I've done has also been in parenting interventions. And so I think, a bunch of our work would suggest that parenting interventions may both help kids to be, might help both decrease psychopathology, but also do so by helping promote more positive early brain development. In terms of the disadvantaged contexts, I think for better or worse, policymakers really find brain data compelling. And so I think in that sense, it can help. I think people are more startled when they realize that there are these associations, that it's not simply kids are, just irresponsible, but rather, the experiences that they're having are affecting their development over time, which increases their risk. Barbara, I think you're muted.
I think you're still muted, Barbara, but you might be repeating my question, which I've just typed, which I can just say, Luke, I was just wondering, you might have said this, and I'm sorry if I missed it, but do you take the brain measures, the brain scans at different points during that kind of cash transfer process? And also, do you have enough cases to kind of vary the design so that, and I need to think about the ethics of this, some families getting more or less. And I'm just thinking back to our conversation yesterday about Greg Duncan's study where he found some effects, but they went away. And I think you said that there's probably not enough money. But yeah, just wondering if there's enough cases to check out some of those things and in an ethical way.
That's a good question. So, in this case, the cash transfer study happened. It happened just after COVID, and so we're piggybacking onto the back of it. Everyone in the treatment group got $1,000. Everyone in the control group got $50 a month. So they all got cash transfers of some sense, but $50 versus $1,000 makes a big difference. And unfortunately, we were successful in getting funding for it, but it took longer than we would have liked. So we're following up now about 2 to 3 years after the intervention ended. And so part of what we're going to be seeing is, are there long-term effects of this intervention through more deep phenotyping? But I think in terms of, can we look at more nuanced things? One of the things is the kids have been getting older, and kids were all different ages when their parents got it. And so one of the things that we can look at, and we're trying to randomize when we see kids, is we can look at, does it matter how old the kids were when the parents got the cash transfer? Will the cash transfers earlier in life make a bigger difference than cash transfers later? And will we see the effects of the brain? If we visit them now, it'll take us 3 years to probably collect the whole data versus the kids that we see later. So we're randomizing that across age so we can separate how long since intervention versus what age they were when they got the intervention. So we can answer some of those questions, but based on the budgets, even the relatively larger NIH budgets, we're only scanning 500 kids, and then we're doing a follow-up with another 700. That's just going to be virtual. So we can only get so deeply into some of those nuances, I think. But if I could get someone to fund me enough that we could do like $1,000 or $2,000 or $3,000, I'd love to see. I have a feeling that if we gave people more unconditional money, it might be more effective.
If you find that funder, can you let me know who they are? Because I've got a request in my back pocket as well.
This intervention was already, I think I calculated once, it was something like $36 million already just to do the original intervention. So it was quite an investment.
Thank you. There's another question from Vanda. Do you maybe want to read out your question yourself? We actually don't have that many questions jumbling up in the chat that I have to collect them so much. So,
yeah, sure. Look, thank you very much. It's really interesting, and my apologies if I missed it, but was wondering if you've also examined parents' educational levels as potential buffering against the effects of neighborhood, and probably a bit of a related question, whether you examined children of parents who are recent immigrants to the country, where they're kind of forced to live in this disadvantaged neighborhoods, and if there are any differences compared to other populations. Thank you very much.
Yeah, good questions. And yeah, I talk fast, so it's easy to miss things. But I didn't, we've used maternal education primarily as a covariate. We haven't looked at it as a potential buffer, but it's a great idea. In a lot of cases, we find that, maternal education might relate to some of these brain outcomes directly, but usually once we add in family income or neighborhood, those are the bigger driving factors. But again, it's because we're looking at parts of the brain that have to do with socio-emotional outcomes. And I think stressful experiences are more important. If we were looking more at parts of the brain that have to do with like cognitive achievement, we might see more for maternal education. Although as someone who does genetically informed work, maternal education is always a tricky one for me because it's also pretty highly heritable. And so it strikes me as always something that we want to look out for in terms of gene environment correlations. But we could look at maternal education as a moderator. And your question about immigrants, I would love to. The samples that we've worked with have not had high representation of immigrants. In most cases, we've piggybacked onto existing cohorts. So we have this, 10, 20-year longitudinal data. And so they haven't been well represented in those studies.
Yeah, thank you so much. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
Thank you. Can I piggyback onto that? Because I was also wondering, do you know any differences between boys and girls there? Because I could imagine that both exposure to violence and responses to violence and parenting could be different for boys and girls.
Yeah, absolutely. We have, in most of our studies, we've not looked deeply at gender differences. We usually control for gender. I think there probably are some, it's interesting for antisocial behavior. Most literature says this is for an outcome that there are baseline differences, like boys have higher rates of antisocial behavior, but that most of the predictors are the same. Boys are just exposed at a higher level and so have higher levels. In general, we've been a little bit cautious about doing too many complex interactions in our data because when I've read the papers on the power that you have for statistical interactions, I always find it kind of humbling. And so even though we've done some of this buffering work, when people suggest we add like another layer like gender, we've been worried about that, but I think it's definitely something that we should be looking at.
Thank you. There's another question from George. George, do you want to come on?
Yeah, I can. I'll try my best. Thanks, Luke. That was super interesting stuff. I was wondering if you could give me maybe a little lay of the land here in regards to the degree to which people have looked at, like you said, non-traumatic or adverse kind of events. So, because like harsh parenting, we might think of as like not as severe as, say, like being in the vicinity of gun violence. But I just wanted to understand if there was like a body of work that's looked at, maybe if there's a threshold point at which a event that changes the kind of situation that a child is in, but isn't necessarily very stressful or adverse for them exists. Sorry, I'm not sure if I'm making myself very clear, but something like as simple as moving home versus parents getting a promotion that isn't the ongoing cash transfer project that you mentioned. Like, is there anything out there in that space?
Yeah, I mean, so there's work in health psychology that shows that even positive changes are stressful. So like getting a promotion is stressful, even though it seems great or moving. We've done some work, especially my colleague Chris Monk in his lab. We've done some work on unpredictability for kids. So having a bunch of moves, and that is related to brain activity. And I would say could be seen as an adversity. And there are models of adversity that posit that there are sort of three main streams, one set that are threatening, that are scary, one set that's about deprivation, like a lack of resources, and one that's about unpredictability. I'm sure there's several others, and they kind of all interact too. So yeah, we've looked at unpredictability in that sense, which we think is hard for the brain to sort of like develop in. But I think one of your questions maybe, are there like thresholds? Most of the work that we've done, we've only seen pretty linear associations between our exposures. And it's interesting because I talk about harsh parenting, but we have a paper where we did a multiverse analysis where you basically take every single variable you possibly could and see how robust everything is across those. And parenting looks like a continuum. Like it goes from corporal punishment and spanking up to, just critiquing your kid too much. And it looks very graded. It doesn't look like once you start spanking your kid or once you start screaming or hitting them, that's somehow a big threshold over which it has bigger effects on behavior of the brain.
Yeah, super interesting. Thank you.
Yeah.
Another question from Deborah.
Yeah, so Luke, I'm just kind of interested in the general state of the science around what we understand about the link between brain structure, which is what you've largely been talking about, and then outcomes, either, mental health outcomes or brain functioning or socioeconomic outcomes. Do we actually know what part of the brain is doing what and whether it's kind of causal?
Yeah, I think what would some people tell you versus what I would tell you. I think I'm still pessimistic about how reliable and robust the brain imaging is in terms of prediction. So it's interesting that this is anecdotal, but I've heard from a lot of colleagues, I think, is that in our data, we're able to predict the brain from experience pretty well. Like if you said, I want you, here's a task that you had people do, pick a couple experiences and see if they'll be related. Almost always they will. But if you said, I want you to use the brain to predict who's going to be at risk for psychopathology, I think that's been a lot more elusive. That's not what the literature would say. There's meta-analyses linking, for example, amygdala reactivity to things like anxiety. But those seem to be less and less robust. And there's some data showing that those effects are very small. And so they probably need samples in the thousands, if not tens of thousands, to reliably detect. Mm-hmm. I think the other thing that's happening in brain imaging is that we're learning sort of like genetics, which is that any one brain area or any one signal is not particularly robust or reliable, and that the best way to predict things reliably is to use multivariate approaches, where we use all of the connections in the brain and we look at these complex things. And so we've been moving to that more and more in my lab, but the challenge is that they have less biological relevance. So I can't tell an audience that's not deep into brain imaging, hey, here's this really complex thing in the brain that helps us predict psychopathology. I think the same kind of thing is happening in genetics, where people are using these huge genome-wide studies and they're explaining more variants, but we don't know what that means. We don't know what those findings really mean biologically. So I think we're going to more complex multivariate solutions, which are probably better predictors, but maybe harder to understand.
Okay. Okay, can I just we still have a little bit. Can I just slide one more in? What do you want to say about causality? Like, I mean, I'm just, as an economist, I'm sort of always curious. Like, I can't even quite imagine how you would get at that in this sort of research.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting because I'm teaching a grad course right now on social development, and I think a lot of psychologists, especially developmental psychologists, don't think in those terms. And I've been trying to hammer home to grad students is the way one of my grad mentors did, which is that when you leave psychology and other fields, they don't really care about your correlational observational data. It's just not that convincing. So we try to do it lots of different ways, right? So I showed you mostly correlational observational data. I have another line of research that's not involving the brain, where we've used these genetically informed designs where we can at least eliminate the confound of shared genes and use kids as sort of like a counterfactual, like two twins as counterfactuals to each other. We can do like propensity score matching kinds of things, and then we can do these, experiments. But all of that is hard, and especially when you're talking about the brain, you can't use, 100,000 people. The biggest study of brain imaging right now is 10,000 people. And that one at least has, 20 sites. So there's some state variability, but we've gotten to this where we go into like census and other kind of data that like economists might use, where we're using state level or city level data. And the problem is, we can't scan people across enough cities and states to have enough variation, or it's very challenging to do, to really be able to do some of those like quasi experiments or policy shocks that you might see in some approaches in economics. So I think that's one of the challenges. And I think most people are just doing observational data and they think it's causal. And I hopefully have convinced you all I don't think that. And that's why we're trying to do it multiple ways. I'd love to give you all this talk in 3 or 4 years once we've really utilized the twin aspect, which I think is better than what we've done so far, but certainly still, only addresses some of the confounds.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. There is another comment from Ha. Before I hand over to her, afterwards we probably have time for one more question. So if you want yours to be on the list, get that up. Do you want to make?
Hi. I don't want to. That's my comment here. So I think that's the. Thank look for very interesting result presentation, and I find that now even we are in different fields. I'm economists like Deborah and many other people on the meeting today. But I think what we do, and the findings are quite similar to across the economics and development science that you do. One of the things that I note following Barbara's comment on the potential gender difference in the effect of social economic background on child development. And we have a forthcoming paper. It examines and actually identifies that differential in the term even within the families. So we see that the different impact of parental background, income, or neighborhoods, or school factors on the gender different in various development outcomes that we observe in our admin and population-based data. And yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, and I think maybe one thing I'll add just for Deborah's comment too, we don't have the brain data with better, stronger methods, but right now I'm teaching this course to students, and there's certainly good, I think, causal data on poverty and income, as well as on parenting, whether we're using intervention studies or quasi experiments, things like the Great Smoky Mountain studies and things like that.
All right, great. So we actually, I think Francis won the race for the last question there. And then we can wrap it up afterwards. So Francis, do you want to go?
I don't know if you can hear me. Maybe you'll be able to see me shortly if I can click the right button. Yes. Yeah, no, basically it's as written there. I'm just wondering, is there any evidence to suggest that, if you enroll sort of, low SES parents, whether it's low SES neighborhood or just low SES parents in some, in parenting programs, is there any evidence that there is a positive impact on brain development for their children over the, in a longitudinal sense or at any point in time, compared to children in the same, ostensibly the same circumstances whose parents were not involved in a parenting intervention or parenting program to I'm thinking, for example, in the Life Course Center, we're associated with a program called the Triple P Positive Parenting Program and so forth. And there've been various studies on that, but I'm not sure if there's anything been done with brain imaging.
Yeah, it's a good question. I would like to. In fact, I was on my sabbatical in Melbourne last year and have been collaborating with someone about doing a parenting program with brain imaging. There is actually some research. Mary Dozier has an intervention called the ABC checkup, which is more attachment based, but it is sort of in the ballpark of a triple P, but for a little bit earlier kids. and they haven't gone out past like 3 or 4 years post-intervention, but they've shown impacts on the parts of the brain that they hypothesized in the tasks they hypothesized from the intervention. So there is at least one study using an RCT design with parenting program to show those effects.
Yeah, and particularly important, if you can, because recruitment at birth or in that sort of, the 0 to 1 period is typically easier than at other periods for various reasons in terms of mandated contacts with health services and so forth. And of course, that sort of 0 to 5 is the most elastic period for brain development. So it's a really useful sort of experimental design if you can make it happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Hey, wonderful. Well, thank you, everyone. I think we've come to the end of this seminar.